All right, welcome, guys. We're starting our next unit, which is going to be skeletal system. Um, Personally, I feel like skeletal system is not that bad. It's a lot of anatomy, a lot of terminology, a little bit of physio, but I think a lot of people succeed in this unit, primarily because it's very physical. Every single bone that we're going to be learning, you can physically touch on the body and feel it. And anytime that you can apply multiple senses to something you're learning, you can typically learn it better. You're going to remember it easier, at least from my experience. Okay, what are the goals for this unit? Comprehend the anatomy and physiology of bones and bone formation, learn the major bones of the appendicular and axial skeleton, and then discuss different diseases that affect the skeletal system. Like I said, I like to finish off my units with a little bit of epidemiology or pathophysiology, sorry, to discuss like some of the diseases that can affect it. In this case, it'll be all related to skeletal system. Okay, doke. So as far as overview of the skeletal system, all of these tissue that you see here, those are all connective tissue. We learned that back in integumentary system. The biggest thing that you need to take note of is right here. Please, please, please make sure that you remember tendons are going to be a connective tissue that connect bone to muscle, whereas ligaments connect bone to bone. Whatever it takes for you to memorize this, do your best. My mnemonic for this is I go with bones tend to connect to muscles. That works for me. If it doesn't really work for you, no big deal. But got to make sure you're comfortable with that. Okay, we'll talk more about cartilage as we progress. Same thing with joints. And obviously, this is skeletal system, so bones are a big part of it. What is the function of the skeletal system? So the functions of the skeletal system, the first one is the most obvious one, support. It literally forms your structure, your body structure. I've mentioned this before in our intro to anatomy unit. If we didn't have bones, we would just be this amorphous blob that would be spazzing. So any animal that has a shape, you can thank the bones for that. Protection of organs. We have this helmet-like structure, our skull, which helps to protect our brain. We have a literal cage that surrounds our chest that's going to help protect the heart and the lungs. Even the hips, the pelvis is going to help protect the reproductive organs, the intestines, the bladder. Movement. Movement's a weird one. Movement's almost like a yin and yang situation. And what I mean by that is when we think of movement, most of us are going to think of muscles. The thing is, the muscles, while they contract, that force that they're generating is going to be applied on something. And what is it going to be applied onto? Bones. So you need both in order for this to work effectively. We'll learn more about muscle movement when we do muscular system. Storage of minerals and fats. Obviously, most people tend to think of calcium as a major mineral. Calcium is one of the major minerals, but we obtain calcium from a lot of different areas, not just like things like milk. We'll talk more about that down the line as far as the whole Got Milk advertising campaign. Vitamin D, we talked about that in the integumentary system. We mentioned how vitamin D is an essential vitamin for bone strength. We get that from the sun. And then even fat. What I tend to think of for fat is when you're eating wings and I typically don't do this because I just don't usually eat it to that extent. A lot of people that like to clean their wings, they may sometimes snap the wings in half and suck out the inside of it, which is going to be all fat. It's nutritious for you. It's not like it's harming you, but that's something that's a little out of my wheelhouse. Finally, this last function of the skeletal system is one of the most important ones, in my opinion. Doesn't really get as much attention. Most people don't really know this about the skeleton. The bones are responsible for creating every single blood cell. Very, very, very important. There is a difference, and we're going to learn this in our next quarter when we cover the cardiovascular system. There is a difference between a blood cell and blood. Blood is the liquid that flows through us. A blood cell is going to be something like a red blood cell, a white blood cell, or a platelet. So we'll learn more about that down the line. Oops, sorry. Okay, moving on. Next, we have our types of bone tissue. So there are 3 types of tissue that we find in the bones. And this picture does a pretty good job of showing us what we see. Compact bone, which is this outer layer. It's going to be hard and dense. Spongy bone, it looks more like Swiss cheese to me if I had to compare it to something. Spongy bone is going to be more towards the middle. It's very porous. If you don't know what that word is, I would make sure you write it down somewhere. Porous basically means holes, like a lot of holes. Um, it does form these small needle-like bones that are very frail called trabeculae. Do I need you guys to remember that? Not necessarily. What's the point of having these regions in the bone that are more porous? Well, for one, it reduces the weight of the bone substantially. Bones are heavy. Bones are always going to be heavy. But if your bones are too heavy, it can obviously restrict your movement, and that would have killed off our species a long time ago. But the most important reason as to why you have these porous regions is what you see in this picture. It creates like a canal system. It allows for vessels like the arteries, the veins, the nerves, the lymph. It allows for all these vessels to make their way through and eventually nourish the bone. Bone is like any other organ. It requires blood. It requires nourishment. What else do we find in this canal system? Bone marrow. I like to think of like a chocolate. It's the nougat found inside. Oh, sorry. So that's going to be the structure that is the most important part of the bone, in my opinion. As far as that's concerned, it is essential for creating any blood cells. As we're going to learn in our next video, the blood cells or the types of marrow do matter. There's red marrow, there's yellow marrow, so all that stuff does matter. Okay, there are 4 classifications of bone, so let's talk about those 4. We have long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. I love this picture because it color codes some stuff for us. In this yellow bone-colored structure, we have the long bones. If you notice, the long bones are exclusively found in the appendages or the appendicular region. So that's going to be the arms and the legs. Short bones are also found in the extremities, like the appendages as well. However, they're very distinct. They're found in the wrist, the knee, and the ankles. Flat bones, as the name implies, are pretty flat. If you literally took them out and put them on the ground, they'd be pretty flat. They're typically curved, as we're going to talk about, but typically we see the flat bones in the upper chest region and the skull. Finally, irregular bones in this blue color, these are going to be bones that just don't really fit any shape. Because they don't really fit any shape, they have their own category. So let's talk about these bones individually one by one. Long bones are typically longer than wide. Makes sense. It's in the name. They have a shaft with heads at both ends. I always think of the classic bone like from Flintstones or any cartoon like where a dog's chewing on a bone. That's usually the bone that you see. Like if you think of Bam Bam from Flintstones, the bone that he's using is typically going to be the femur, one of the largest bones of the human body found in your thigh. It is mostly compact bone. That said, does that mean compact bone cannot be damaged? For sure. Compact bone can get damaged. It just depends on the bone. It depends on the injury. The femur, being one of the most dense bones that it is, it's very difficult to harm. But in some freak accidents that can occur, especially like in motor accidents where you're moving at a faster speed, the femur can snap. And what you have to be very careful with is you have a primary artery found in the thigh region. And if that gets damaged, you could bleed out within minutes. By the way, if you've ever wondered why the elbow region, which feels so funky when you bang it against something, why they call that the funny bone, it's because it's connected to the humerus. I know. All right, short bones. Short bones, as the name implies, they're tiny. I think of like little pebbles being thrown across a lake. They're generally speaking cube-shaped. The examples that they give us here are going to be the carpals. I had to learn when I was in college every single one of these bones. We don't have to do that. That's a little too much. So I'm perfectly fine with just learning, hey, all of these together, they're called the carpals. Now, here's what's interesting. The short bones are mostly spongy bone. Because they're mostly spongy, they're going to provide for a wider range of motion. So you can do stuff with your hand that your hips, for instance, just can't. Flat bones. Flat bones, as the name implies, like we mentioned, are thin and flattened, but they're typically curved because they're curved according to the contours of your body, your skull, your rib cage, your sternum, your clavicle, your scapula. All these are flat bones. Now, the unique thing about the flat bones is that they are thin layers of compact bone with a layer of spongy bone. Because of that, every single flat bone has a more dense region and a softer region. So, for instance, if we're talking about the skull, what part of the skull is going to be more dense? Forehead. The forehead's going to be more dense, whereas the back of the skull is not going to be as dense. That's what we observe with regards to flat bones. And again, we already talked about some of those examples. And then finally, irregular bones. These are the black sheep in this case. These are bones that just don't belong. They have a weird shape, so they didn't belong with the rest of the group. So they form their own group, irregular bones. The classic examples that we see are going to be the vertebrae and the hip. The vertebrae together, that's the plural, vertebral singular. The vertebrae together form like a ladder-like structure called the vertebral column or the spine. Not only is that very dense, and it's going to help with regards to your posture and setting up your back, your natural curvature, which that's a whole thing we're going to talk about, but it also helps to protect one of the largest nerves of the human body and one of the most important nerves of the human body, the spinal cord. If the spinal cord is damaged, that could lead to paralysis and serious problems and complications. Okay, so that's where we're going to finish. About 10 slides in, as I mentioned, not too bad. There is quite a number of slides in this particular session. We have about 72. So it'll take us a couple of videos to get through this stuff, but I have faith that we'll get done with this stuff in a relatively decent amount of time. Okay, so with all that said, guys, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you guys on the next one.